I help you?
Yes, my son-in-law called. He was playing golf this morning at 9:30. My daughter's been missing since this morning. She's 8 months pregnant. She took her dog for a walk in the park. The dog came home with just a leash on.
And the dog came back without your daughter?
Right.
What concerns me the most is the fact that your dog came home with a leash on. That bothers me, I mean, no question.
The suspicion that it's been turned to me. And it turned to me because of the inappropriate romantic that I had with Amber Frey.
Scott Peterson claimed to be on a fishing trip when Laci disappeared on Christmas Eve 2002. The case broke wide open when his mistress, Amber Frey, came forward to say she had been having an affair with Peterson.
Scott told me he was not married.
At about 11:43 a.m. this morning, a little bit before 12 o'clock, we got the report from a dog walker of a pretty badly decomposed body and then washed ashore.
Look at this. All the people who have gathered to catch a glimpse of Peterson as he was driven here from San Diego by detectives.
He killed his wife and his baby. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I have no doubt about it.
Are you afraid police will arrest you?
No. I know there's no basis. I mean, I had nothing to do with her disappearance. So there's no possible evidence or anything like that.
Investigation, your true correct answer?
Yes, sir.
You, sir, charged in count 1 for violation of Penal Code Section 187, alleging murder.
Scott Peterson, on death row for the murder of his pregnant wife, Laci, is speaking out for the first time about the guilty verdict.
I was staggered by it. I had no idea it was coming.
The trial of Scott Peterson riveted the nation back in 2005. When the verdict came down, people cheered in the streets.
We find the defendant, Scott Lee Peterson, guilty of the crime of murder of Laci Denise Peterson.
Peterson describes that moment in a phone call to his sister Janey.
There's just like this amazing, horrible physical reaction that I had. I couldn't feel my feet on the floor. I couldn't feel the chair I was sitting in. My vision was even a little blurry, and I just had this weird sensation that I was falling forward and down, and there was going to be no end to this falling forward and down, like there was no floor to land on.
Some see flaws in the prosecution evidence, including 11 witnesses who say they saw Laci Peterson walking her dog in the neighborhood after her husband left on a fishing trip.
I wasn't the last one to see Laci that day. There were so many witnesses who saw her walking in the neighborhood after I left.
Peterson claims the murder is connected to a mysterious burglary across the street.
The cops just never followed up on the burglary across the street. The police failed to find my family.
But now a group that focuses on wrongful convictions is taking on his case.
The Innocence Project is honing in on this burglary that happened across the street from Laci and Scott's home.
One of the working theories is that Laci Peterson came out of this house right here, 523 Covina, and there was a burglary in progress right across the street at 516. So we're going to make that drive to see where the van would have gone. It's about a mile away over to this alleyway where this burnt out orange van was located. This is the alley where the orange van was discovered December 25th, 2002. The van was found right here, fully engulfed in flames, about a mile away from Scott and Laci Peterson's home. This is in a notorious, dangerous area of town, and now some wonder if evidence found inside that van could hold a critical clue to this case. But as it turns out, it was on this dirt pathway, this alleyway that goes, in between these rows of the backs of homes, and it turns out that one of those homes, the back fence, belongs to a family member of one of the burglars. Is it connected? That's what the Los Angeles Innocence Project is looking to find out.
Let's bring in the lead detective who originally investigated the Peterson case, former Modesto Police Detective John Bueller. It would be different, Mr. Bueller, if you knew about this van and hid that from the defense, but by all indications, this would be new information to you as well. What do you make of this van with the alleged human blood stain.
Chris, it is new information to me. I hadn't heard anything about this before, and if we missed it, that's on us. There's always a possibility we can miss things, and we do, but that's what the system is designed for. My feeling is, and I'm sure Mark's feeling is the same thing, test it. Let's see what we got there.
I've never for a minute thought that Scott had the capability or the motivation to do this. I never thought that there was physical evidence that connected Scott to this. Given all of the evidence that I saw, given the fact that that bay had to be the most searched area in America for the 4 months that she was missing, I just don't see it. I've never seen it, and I'm hopeful that that he's exonerated.
Probably the most infuriating things for the victims in this case is to have this killer still deny it to their face, take no responsibility.
Our family's going to make it. We're stronger because of this. And Scott got what he deserved.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tara Marie, and welcome to my channel, True Crime Matters, where we talk about and analyze everything true crime. If you haven't seen it, make sure you catch part 1 of this video, where we dive deep into the different sections of the new Scott Peterson motion just filed by the LA Innocence Project. That video was pretty in-depth, but there's a few other little interesting things I wanted to talk about too with you guys that we're kind of with the document, and it will be in this order. 1, a recent declaration by Susan Medina, the neighbor who lived across the street from the Petersons who was burglarized. 2, declarations by private investigators Carl Jensen and Gary Irmoian. And finally, a declaration by Scott Peterson himself. So as for Susan Medina, she wrote, "Our neighborhood was very close-knit. Our neighbors all looked out for one another and would take notice when something was amiss in the neighborhood. I recall instances of seeing Laci interacting with people out on the street. In one instance, I was inside my home and I recall Laci yelling at some teenagers who were in her yard, and she told them to get out of her yard. I also recall having a conversation with one of our neighbors, Lil Eichard, about an incident she witnessed involving Laci. Lil told me she witnessed Laci confronting and yelling at some people who were fighting in the street. I believe that conversation occurred after Laci's disappearance. We both commented on how feisty and protective Laci was. Lil, who was herself Portuguese, commented that that must be, quote, the Portuguese in Laci. Lil is now deceased. I recall another occasion when I was outside my home pruning some plants. Laci spotted me and came over telling me I was doing a terrible job of pruning. She told me in a polite way that I wasn't pruning my plants correctly and there was a better way to do it if I wanted them to grow better. Laci was a horticulture major, so she would really know what she was talking about. But anyway, Medina wrote, I recall that while thinking Laci was very polite, it was also very bold of her to come over and tell me how to do my own pruning. When we first moved to the neighborhood, there was not much foot or bike traffic on Covina. Back then, typically, the only people out and about on the street lived in the neighborhood. At some point, the city constructed a pedestrian walkway bridge over Dry Creek in the park, connecting Scenic Drive to Covina Avenue. When this bridge went up, there was a large increase in foot and bike traffic on our street. This created a thoroughfare for people from the airport district, which was a fairly high crime area, traveling on foot or bike to the area of Modesto north of the park. The presence of homeless and transient people also increased when the Modesto Gospel Mission opened at the corner of Yosemite and Rufino Avenue, which operated as an overnight homeless shelter. I recall that every morning around 6 a.m., the shelter would close and the occupants would have to leave for the day, many of them traveling on foot through our neighborhood. With the increase in foot traffic, we also started to have more people digging through our trash and recycling on a regular basis. We started taking added precautions when we noticed an increase in foot and bicycle traffic on our street. When we left home at around 10:30 a.m. on December 24, 2002, we had large manila envelopes as outgoing mail in our mailbox. She has in parentheses here, I worked from home and mailed out several manila envelopes that day to applicants. And she says attachment C is an accurate depiction of what the outgoing mail looked like from our mailbox the morning of December 24, 2002. When we left our house around 10:30 a.m. on December 24, 2002 to go out of town to visit relatives over the Christmas holiday, we locked the gate to our backyard before leaving. As we were driving down Covina, Rudy, which I believe is her husband, pointed a man out to me that looked suspicious. This man was wearing a flannel shirt and was slowly riding past our house on a bike while heading north of the east side of Covina. He was not actively pedaling when we passed him. He was just kind of slowly walking his bike. He was a white man, and the look of him made me feel uncomfortable. He looked out of place, and something about him made me nervous. We circled the block. It would only have taken less than a minute to circle the block. I didn't see the man when we drove back by our home on Covina. With the way that Covina is situated, had he taken the path to the park, we would have seen him by the time we circled back, but we didn't see where he went. When we returned from our trip on December 26, 2002, we were shocked by the presence of so many media vans on Covina. After showing our IDs to law enforcement on Covina, we approached our home. I remember Rudy noticing our dolly in the front yard as we pulled in. Rudy entered the back doors of our house, which had been kicked in, and he had me wait outside. Rudy then came running out of the house and announced that we had been robbed. Immediately, the police, which were focused on the Petersons' home, started coming over to us and our residence as we reported the burglary. The detectives were going back and forth between the Peterson home and our house. I remember being concerned that with all the media there, that reporters were going to think that we were suspects in whatever had happened at the Petersons' home, since the police were now looking at our house. I was also concerned because they were not wearing shoe coverings when going back and forth between houses, and I was concerned about cross-contamination of evidence, which is very smart of her. At some point, I remember Doug Lovell coming over to our residence. He was working with the Modesto Police Department. I knew Doug's wife, Peggy, through work. I recall Doug coming to our house to look at evidence. I walked him through, and the detectives through the house, pointing out things that were out of place. I had just cleaned the house ahead of our trip, so I could tell what had been touched by the burglars. I recall offering to the police that they could take the front doors if they needed them as evidence. I remember they had been kicked in, and there was a footprint on the doors. They declined to take the doors. I remember when we entered our master bedroom, Rudy's hammer from his shed and one of his work gloves were on our bed. The head of the hammer was wrapped in the glove in such a way that it made me think it was being used to suppress the noise of using the hammer to hit something. I do not believe the police collected the hammer nor the glove. I cannot recall whether they swabbed either of them or checked them for fingerprints. Also on the bed is a statue of the Virgin Mary, which had been atop the safe. Again, I recall pointing out to the police so that they would know that the burglars touched that. Next to the statue was an envelope that I kept our monthly allowance of cash in. I recall there being about $400 in the envelope when we left. When we returned, the envelope was missing the majority of the cash. When I suggested to the police to fingerprint items in our home that had been touched or disturbed, the detective told me that I, quote, watch too much CSI. Yikes. Before 2000, my husband and I were concerned about Y2K, so we made sure that we had a stash of cash in our home, amounting to around $50,000. After 2000, we started spending some of the cash, around $10,000 for a trip to Denver to celebrate our parents' anniversary. After various expenditures, we had roughly $30,000 left. The cash was stored in paper-wrapped bundles inside a Bank of America cash bag. Inside our home, we had a calendar on the side of the refrigerator that noted LA on December 25th and RT from LA, returning home from LA on December 26th. So I guess she thinks that maybe was something the burglar saw and knew she wasn't going to be home. Attachment D is a copy of our calendar. When we returned from our trip, we checked our mailbox. I specifically recall that only 3 items were in my mailbox, including 1 red envelope containing a Christmas card, 1 "Have you seen me?" mass mailer, and a 3.5 solicitation "Have you seen me?" mailer not related to Laci Peterson. The 3 items of mail were small and did not protrude from my mailbox. After Rudy and I learned about Laci's disappearance, we immediately became concerned and did what we could do to offer relief to the Peterson family. We asked them to use our home as a safe place to get away from the media frenzy that was ongoing and constantly in front of our home. I recall one day when Scott's father, Lee, was mowing the lawn, people gathered on the street and were shouting obscenities at him. The bright lights from the media van were a constant presence. I recall getting a pair of red slippers for Scott's mother, Jackie, so she could put them on and relax when she came over to my house to get away from the chaos going on inside her son and daughter-in-law's home. I recall one evening night after we returned home and learned that Laci was missing, Scott was at our home, and I stood next to him to try to comfort him. I told him that Rudy and I were concerned because among the items that were in our safe that were stolen were 2 guns of Rudy's. The guns were licensed and registered, but we would feel horrible if any harm had come to Laci through use of our guns. When I was telling Scott of our concerns, he started to cry. I put my hand on his shoulder to comfort him. We were told that the police arrested 2 individuals for the burglary. The police never showed either me or my husband any pictures of the men that they had arrested to see if we could identify them. When I think back, I can't help but wonder if the man that we saw just before leaving our house who was on the bike was involved. I feel that if I had been shown a picture of him back then, I may have been able to identify him. The police then started coming by our house to show us items that they had recovered to see if they were our property. While some of the property they showed me was mine, there were also items that did not belong to me. I recall being shown jewelry that included a small opal stone, a tiny sapphire, and a little emerald ring that were not mine. I also recall seeing jewelry that I thought were fake and I did not recognize. I informed the officers that those were not mine. There were also items of jewelry of mine that were never recovered. Also, the cash that we had stored in the safe was never returned to us. I recall police showing us money wrappers matching the paper wrappers that had been around the bundles of cash we had, but we were told that no cash was recovered. One of the police detectives doing the investigation mentioned to me that one of the burglars admitted to making a call from inside our home. I was never asked by police whether my husband nor I heard anything unusual coming from the Petersons' home the night of the 23rd, which was the night before Laci went missing, such as arguing or shouting before we left for our trip. I recall that we did not hear anything unusual or any indications of a fight on that night or on any other night. The only time there was noise coming from the Petersons' home was during football season, and Scott would always come to let us know ahead of time that they were having people over. On those occasions, I would leave our lights on so we could provide security for his guests. When we went on our trip, we left our dog, Diana, in the backyard of our residence. Diana would often bark when anyone approached the house. Had the burglary happened in the middle of the night or early morning, she certainly would have barked and made a ruckus, yet no neighbors, police, search party members, or anyone else reported to us that Diana made any noises in the early morning of December 26th. Then Susan concludes this declaration with the words, "I have always been bothered by the lack of investigation of the burglary of our home and the possible connection to Laci's disappearance and murder." Signed and dated July 29th, 2023. It sounds like Susan Medina very strongly believes that there definitely is something fishy about the fact that the burglars lied about the date, and it's very interesting that she is the one who pointed out the issue about the mail only sticking out of the mailbox on the 24th. I would think that someone who really cares about their mail getting picked up before Christmas, certainly if it has something to do with her job, she would really remember something like that. And to me, this really doesn't sit well at all. On to the declarations by the private investigators. I'll start with the shortest one, the declaration of private investigator Carl Jensen. He states that several times he interviewed Stephen Todd, one of the men who burglarized the Medina home across the street from the Petersons. He goes on to say that he, quote, interviewed Todd 3 times in 2004. This would have been most likely during the trial. I understood that Todd had claimed that he had committed the burglary on December 26, 2002. During my 3rd interview with Mr. Todd, which occurred on August 27, 2004, which was from San Mateo County Jail, which happened to be in the middle of Scott Peterson's trial, I confronted Todd with Diane Jackson's statements that she had seen a safe on the front of the Medina home and a van parked in front of the home at 11:40 a.m. on December 24, 2002. In response, Todd became what I would describe as unglued. Todd came out of his chair, put his hands on the table, and leaned toward me yelling words to the effect that, "You do not have a witness," and "You do not have an effing thing." At that point, the female deputy sheriff came to the room to ask if I was okay. I told her we're fine. Todd was so angry that he informed me he would invoke his right to remain silent if he were called to testify about the burglary. Additionally, in that same interview, Todd informed me that he was so high on the substances METH and CRACK for 3 days that I don't really remember anything I did. Todd later explained that this 3-day period was between December 24th and December 26, 2002. So that is very interesting, and once again, it all seems to come back to this Mr. Todd character. Now I'll read you one of the more interesting ones I've ever read. A signed declaration by a second private investigator named Gary Ermoian, who has worked on the case since the very first week Laci went missing. Now, this guy came off as pretty reputable to me because it seems he's been employed as a private investigator for 43 years, has a doctorate in criminal justice, and works as a general partner and instructor at the California School of Investigation. Also, prior to becoming a PI, he was a deputy sheriff with the Stanislaus County Sheriff's Office from 1976 to 1980, so a pretty brilliant guy. Anyway, he says here that in late December of 2002, I learned that the Modesto Police Department was targeting Scott as their main suspect, accusing him of being responsible for his wife's disappearance and executing search warrants to search for evidence that would show he was guilty. I met with Scott Peterson, and he explained to me that he was concerned about finding his wife and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He was worried that because the police were focusing their investigation on him, valuable time was being lost in the search to find his wife and finding out what happened to her. Scott explained that the police were questioning his whereabouts on December 24th. He stated to me that he had gone to Berkeley Marina and he put his fishing boat in the water there sometime around midday on December 24th, and that he had seen a few people there that day who could confirm he was telling the truth. Scott stated that Laci told him she was going to take their dog for a walk in the morning of December 24th, and after he left home for the day, and we discussed the importance of canvassing the neighborhood to try and determine if anyone actually saw her walking the dog. I recall that Scott was assisting in the search for Laci. We always hear Scott didn't help, but here he's saying that Scott assisted in the search for Laci by working with the community volunteer center that had been set up at the Red Line Inn in downtown Modesto. The volunteer center was receiving calls and tips from community members who were calling in to report information they believed may be helpful in finding Laci Peterson. Some of the callers were reporting that they had called the Modesto Police Department tip line and left messages, but they were not hearing back from anyone to follow up on their information. Initially, the police were questioning Scott's alibi and claiming that they were unable to confirm he had gone to Berkeley Marina, as he had told them. I was notified on January 4, 2003, a City of Berkeley gardener who works at Berkeley Marina named Michael Ilvesta. Mr. Ilvesta recalled that he was driving through the parking area and saw that Scott was having trouble turning and backing his trailer down the launch ramp, and he had to stop and wait because there wasn't enough room for a vehicle to pass when somebody is backing down the launch ramp. On January 7, 2003, I also contacted David Johnson, who told me that he was at Berkeley Marina on December 24th and saw Scott's Ford pickup truck and trailer parked in the parking lot near the launch. Mr. Johnson explained that he called the police on Friday, Saturday, and Monday, trying to give a statement, and was finally able to speak to Detective Grogan on the third try. Mr. Johnson stated that he was, quote, ticked off because the police were not making any effort to talk to the people who live at the marina to confirm Scott's information that he was actually there that day. He agreed to compile a list of names of people who were also at the marina and may have information and provide it to me. Mr. Johnson explained that it would be impossible for anyone to conceal a large object in a small, open aluminum boat, such as Mr. Peterson's boat, because after launching the boat, it would have to pass by all the docked boats in the area, which were inhabited by residents at the time. On January 9, 2003, I contacted Dave Casey, who worked at the marina. Mr. Casey stated that he had been repairing boats at that location for over 30 years, and that he was there on December 24th, but he did not recall seeing Mr. Peterson. Mr. Casey stated that it was the season to fish for sturgeon, and that it was not at all unusual to see boats the size of Scott's in the bay fishing for sturgeon. He said that this size of boat is typically the boat of choice for people who fish for sturgeon. On January 9, 2003, I contacted Nick Clinton, who had a boat docked near the public launch at Berkeley Marina. Mr. Clinton stated that he recalled seeing one small vessel going out from the public launch that day and one truck and trailer in the parking lot on December 24th, but after looking at photos, he could not say it was Scott's truck and trailer. Mr. Clinton suggested I talk to Juror Faria, who was also on his boat with him that day, because Mr. Faria was standing in the cockpit while Mr. Clinton was down in the cabin working on the boat engine. On January 9, 2003, I contacted Yuri Farina, who lived on his boat at Berkeley Marina. Mr. Farina did recall seeing Scott's truck and boat, which he identified from photographs. He stated that he pays attention to the boats more closely than vehicles because he works on boats. Mr. Farina recalled being on Mr. Clinton's boat that day and watching from the cockpit as the person who was putting the boat in the water did the launch. The person appeared to be not experienced because he seemed to be having trouble. He looked at a photo of Scott and said he looked familiar, but he couldn't say if for sure it was the person he saw on December 24th because he may have been familiar from viewing Scott's photo on the internet. Mr. Farino said he did not recall seeing any object inside the aluminum boat except some type of camouflage clothing like a jacket or pants. Mr. Farina said he recalled the brown and green colors. I know from the photos I've received that were taken by MPD during the search of Scott's warehouse on December 26th and 27th that a camouflage jacket was found in his boat. Mr. Farina also stated that he spoke to Detective Owens from the Modesto Police Department, but the only question that Mr. Owens asked him was whether he saw Laci Peterson at the marina on December 24th. I remained in contact with Mr. Farina after I interviewed him because I believed his eyewitness account might be important testimony if the police were to accuse Mr. Peterson of being involved in the disappearance of Laci. On September 15, 2004, while Mr. Peterson's trial was ongoing, Mr. Farina contacted me via email stating that he had heard he may be needed to assist in the case. Mr. Farina is not a native English speaker, and his email reflects that, but I understood him to mean that he would make himself available to testify at Mr. Peterson's trial if it was needed. I replied to Mr. Farina via email that I would convey to Mr. Peterson's attorney, Mark Garagos, that he was available if needed, and I would get back in contact with him to let him know. I conveyed to Mr. Garagos that while Mr. Farina was available to testify if needed, but Mr. Garagos never asked me to have Mr. Farina travel to San Mateo County so he could testify. Based upon the statements of these witnesses and the receipts Scott provided, it was obvious he was at the Berkeley Marina on December 24, 2002, and based on my interview with Yuri Farina and the proximity of Mr. Clinton's boat to the launch ramp, I concluded that there was nothing large like a body inside of Scott's boat that day. As shown in the photo below, it depicts the launch ramp and the location of Mr. Clinton's boat circled in red. Scott had to drive his boat right past Nick Clinton's boat, and Yuri stated that he was standing in the cockpit of Mr. Clinton's boat, which was an elevated position, meaning he had good visibility looking down and into Scott's boat. Now, this investigator's declaration goes on to note witnesses that he spoke to that claim to have seen Laci walking that day. In fact, some of which we already talked about, but they were concerned that the police were not taking their sightings seriously, and many of them were frustrated. But one specific sighting that I wanted to mention from Investigator Gary's declaration was Miss Aguilar. She stated that she lived 2 doors down on 215 Covina Avenue, so two doors away from Laci and Scott. And she told me, this is what he's saying, she and her husband were driving down La Loma Avenue, heading west on December 24, 2002, around 10:30 to 10:45, and she saw a pregnant woman matching the description of Laci Peterson walking a golden retriever dog on La Loma Avenue, but about 1 block east of La Loma Park. And she stated that she has seen photographs of Laci Peterson, and she is certain that it was Mrs. Peterson. She further stated that she recognized Mrs. Peterson because she had seen her on a prior occasion at a medical center. She also recalled seeing a flower tattoo on Mrs. Peterson's ankle, which Scott confirmed to me was a tattoo that his wife did have. Another resident, Grace Wolf, said she had spoken to Laci and Scott before, so she knew it was her. And finally, Gary interviewed a Miss Garcia, who stated that she saw an older, light-colored van parked along the curb by La Loma Park, and it appeared to her there had been some kind of scuffle. The door van was shut in a hurry, and she saw quilted material get caught in the door, and then the van squealed its tires and quickly pulled away, running through the stop sign and turning right towards downtown. She said it gave her a bad feeling, so she made a comment to the driving student to take the license plate number down. She said she recalled faded Texas plates with NGH4 included in this number. The van had solid sides, no windows, and she saw paint chipping. The rear windows were tinted and mirrored. She stated that she thought it was a Chevy. And most interestingly in these interviews is this investigator did interviews with a Supreme Court judge that lived right around the corner from Laci and Scott. He stated that on December 23, 2002, at approximately 10:15 p.m., somebody knocked on his door. He was already in bed, and by the time he got to the door, he saw a man walking across the lawn. He went outside to confront the man, who he described in his late 30s, 170 pounds, about 5 feet tall, with dirty blonde hair. The man asked for money, and Judge Cordova stated that he sent the man away and felt the man was casing his home and possibly the neighborhood. Judge Cordova stated that another neighbor, Albert Yu, told him the same guy who was casing Judge Cordova's home came to his door on December 23, 2002, and said he was looking for his dog. Judge Cordova stated that early on in December 25, 2002, he spoke to Detective Banks of the Modesto Police Department, who he knew from prior cases he had worked on, and explained the events that occurred that night of December 23, 2002. The judge noticed that Detective Banks did not take any notes or write down Judge Cordova's statement. When Judge Cordova pointed out a pair of women's sandals with a flower pattern he noticed lying alongside the road 3 houses away from the Petersons, Detective Banks showed no interest in the sandals and walked on. The next day, on December 26, Judge Cordova saw Detective Ridenhour and repeated what he had told Detective Banks. Detective Ridenhour told Judge Cordova to speak to a sergeant, which he did. The following day, Modesto Detective Reed went to the Judge Cordova's home, and he again counted what had happened with the man casing his home on December 23, 2002. Judge Cordova stated that it was obvious there was no communication between the officers because Detective Reed had no information about his prior reports. Judge Cordova stated that he had met the Petersons at a community meeting regarding issues in the neighborhood, and he recalled Scott and Laci saying that when they took walks in the park and encountered homeless or transient people camping out, they would approach them and tell them to leave. Judge Cordova said he thought this to be a bit bold and potentially dangerous. He was concerned to think that Laci might be bold enough to confront someone like this on her own. Based on my experience as an investigator, my review of other tips and leads that were called into MPD regarding witnesses who reported seeing vans in and around the neighborhood, and the information I received from the witnesses above concerning apparent criminal activity that was occurring in and around the Petersons' neighborhood at the time Laci disappeared. It was my view at the time, and it remains my view to this day, that the Modesto Police Department did not conduct a thorough investigation into the Medina burglary. There was no police investigation, to my knowledge, into whether other individuals participated in that burglary, in addition to Stephen Todd and Glenn Pierce. Nor was there any investigation into the suspicious-looking vans that witnesses reported seeing on Covina and in the area on December 24th, to my knowledge. This is incredible to me. I can't imagine that somebody would put their reputation on the line in this manner, especially somebody who has, 43 years of experience, who's actually like training other investigators. I can't imagine they would put their reputation on the line like this to just write this stuff for money. It doesn't make any sense to me. I believe all signs here are pointing to the fact that this burglary was not properly investigated. Not saying Scott's innocent by any means, but this is very strange. It blows my mind that the statements made by particularly Mrs. Medina and the judge, that they're recalling specific pieces of evidence that they pointed out to these detectives that were kind of like almost mocked or ignored. It's mind-blowing, and it's scary. Anyone listening to this should be scared. On to the final thing I wanted to say in this video. It is a declaration of actual innocence by Scott himself, and it reads, "I am 51 years old and currently incarcerated by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation at Mule Creek State Prison in California, serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. In 2004, I was wrongfully convicted of murdering my wife, Laci Peterson, and our unborn son, Connor. The identity of the perpetrator or perpetrators of the crimes for which I was wrongly convicted has always been a contested issue in this case. I have steadfastly maintained my innocence from the moment my wife went missing on December 24th, 2002, throughout my trial, appeal, and post-conviction proceedings, and to this day. I had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance and deaths of my wife and son. I am not a violent person. I have never had a physical fight or a violent incident with anyone in my life. I am a law-abiding citizen who had no criminal record prior to my arrest in this case. I have never had any incident or rule violation report since my wrongful incarceration began in 2003. I did not harm or kill my family. At my request and on my behalf, investigations into who is responsible for the deaths of my wife and son have been ongoing over the last 21 years and continue to this day. In the course of these investigations, I have discovered that critical exculpatory evidence was ignored, overlooked, or never investigated at all, and in other instances was suppressed at the time of my trial. Newly discovered evidence that was not presented to the jury at my trial supports my claim of innocence. As part of my ongoing effort to prove my innocence, I submit this declaration setting forth the evidence that supports my claim of innocence. In support of my motion for DNA testing of certain items of physical evidence pursuant to Penal Code Section 1405, and in support of my motion for post-conviction discovery pursuant to Penal Code Section 1054.9 for production of evidence that has to date not been turned over, evidence I believe will further support my claim of innocence. Laci and I lived in Stanislaus County on December 24, 2002, when she was abducted. Laci was missing for almost 4 months. The remains of our son Connor and my wife's remains were found almost 4 months later on April 13th and 14th, 2003, respectively, along the shoreline of East San Francisco Bay. The police immediately and erroneously targeted me as the prime suspect. I cooperated fully with the police when I discovered Laci was missing, but it became clear to me from day one that no matter how much I cooperated, the police believed I was responsible for my wife's disappearance. During the search to find Laci, the police continually ignored evidence showing my innocence, including eyewitness reports that Laci was alive and walking our dog the day she disappeared. In addition, search warrants were served on me, beginning with the first one executed on December 26, 2002, on our home, vehicles, computers, financial reports, phone records, boat, my office, and warehouse, from which hundreds of items of purported evidence were collected, but no physical or direct evidence implicated me in the killing of my family was ever found. I now know that I was also subjected to constant and relentless 24-hour surveillance by law enforcement while Laci was missing, including thousands of wiretapped and recorded phone conversations. GPS tracking devices were mounted on my vehicle so police could have me under constant surveillance. A pole camera was mounted outside our home on January 3, 2003, to monitor when I came and went, and police officers waited in unmarked vehicles parked around the corner from our home to follow my every move, even as I left to go distribute missing persons flyers or to assist at the volunteer center with the search for Laci, or to go look into tips from people who were calling in to report a possible sighting of Laci. Once again, none of the evidence obtained through the extensive surveillance of my movements implicated me in any of my family's disappearance or deaths. I was interviewed by police for more than 12 hours in what felt to me like custodial settings. Modesto Police Detective Al Brocchini repeatedly told me he was merely trying to eliminate me as a suspect, but I was clearly the only suspect the police were seriously looking into. I provided the information in this declaration to the police when they were investigating Laci's disappearance in December of 2002 and January 2003. I provided detailed answers to all of the questions the police asked me about my activities and whereabouts on the day Laci was abducted during those interviews. Of those 12 hours of interviews I had with police, only 1 hour was actually recorded and preserved on tape. The unrecorded interviews were summarized in written police reports that I have reviewed. These reports contain omissions, misstatements, and outright falsehoods. I recall providing much more information to the police, including during many phone calls I made to them, conveying tips and leads, information that is not included in the written reports. After Laci and Connor's remains were found on April 13th and 14th, I was arrested and charged with killing my family. I pleaded not guilty to the charges. My preliminary hearing took place in Stanislaus County, but the venue of my trial was changed to San Mateo County Superior Court due to the overwhelming and unprecedented nature of the media frenzy surrounding Laci's disappearance. My trial took place over 6 months in 2004, during which the prosecution called over 150 witnesses in the guilt phase of my trial, but presented no physical, forensic, or direct evidence linking me to the deaths of my wife and son. I was found guilty by a jury on November 12, 2004, and sentenced to death on March 16, 2005. I was sent to serve my sentence on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where I spent the next 15 years waiting for my direct appeal to be filed and decided by the Supreme Court. On August 24, 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned my death sentence because the trial court improperly dismissed prospective jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty, but nevertheless attested in their questionnaire responses that they would have no difficulty imposing a death sentence if that is what the law required. On May 16, 2021, while preparing for a second penalty phase trial, I asked my attorney to request additional discovery from the prosecution that had not yet been turned over to my defense team and me, including police investigation reports from 2002 and 2003, and new leads or tips in the possession of the prosecution team, among other items. On May 28, 2021, 12 days after the informal request for discovery was sent, I was informed that the prosecution decided not to pursue a retrial of the penalty phase and instead defaulted to sentencing me to life without the possibility of parole. The discovery I requested in 2021 has never been produced by the prosecution to my knowledge. I am again seeking that discovery in the motion I am filing with the court now, along with other items that have never been provided by the prosecution. When the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office decided not to seek the death penalty against me a second time, I was resentenced to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole at a hearing held on December 8, 2021. On November 24, 2015, before my appeal was decided, I filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in the California Supreme Court, raising statutory and state and federal constitutional claims of error, including a claim of juror misconduct and several claims that the prosecution presented false and unreliable expert testimony and evidence related to 1. scent dog evidence, 2. fetal biometry, and 3. movements of bodies in water in violation of my state and federal rights to due process and of Penal Code Section 1473, among other claims. On October 14, 2020, the California Supreme Court issued an order to show cause as to claim 1 in a position for writ of habeas corpus as to why relief should not be granted on the ground that juror number 7 committed prejudicial misconduct by not disclosing her prior involvement with other legal proceedings, including that she sought a restraining order while she was pregnant in 2000 out of fear that physical harm would come to her unborn child. I read in the briefing that juror number 7 was separately a victim of DV in 2000 while she was pregnant with another child. The California Supreme Court summary denied the other claims raised in my petition without a reasoned opinion. I attended the evidentiary hearing that was held in San Mateo County's Superior Court in August of 2022 concerning juror number 7's alleged prejudicial misconduct. The Superior Court acknowledged that juror number 7 was not truthful on her juror questionnaire, but still denied the claim because the judge found that her misconduct was not motivated by any bias against me. On April 19th of 2023, I filed a pro se petition for a writ of habeas corpus in the California Court of Appeal for the First District, seeking review of the Superior Court's denial of my claim that juror 7 committed prejudicial misconduct, which is currently pending. In my pro se 2023 petition, I also raised claims that the prosecution presented false evidence against me at trial, and I submitted new evidence of a confession made by one of the individuals involved in the burglary of our neighbor's home who admitted to killing my family. In July of 2023, I contacted the Los Angeles Innocence Project and asked them to investigate the evidence in my case and determine whether a post-conviction discovery motion and motion for DNA testing should be filed so that further investigation can be conducted into who is responsible for killing my family. I believe this additional information will assist in determining what happened to my family and prove that I am innocent and had nothing to do with these horrible crimes that were committed against my wife and son. I have reviewed this declaration in its entirety, and it is accurate to the best of my knowledge. I declare under penalty of perjury pursuant to the laws of the state of California that the foregoing is true and correct. Wow. So that is Scott Peterson's declaration that was just submitted to the court. This case, so often, things were kind of blown up in the news, and so many times I'm hearing so many different podcasters and news personalities just regurgitating stuff they heard on other channels, and it seems like they're not even reading the actual trial transcripts or reading anything that's actually out there that has what went on during trial. So I just wanted to make sure that I actually read what the heck was submitted here. And I think it's an extremely important case. I think it's important that these burglars actually get looked into, because remember, the entire time we were being told that the burglary was committed on a completely different day. That doesn't seem to be the case with all the other evidence that, I read in this motion. So, extremely important, I think, for it to be looked at. This entire motion was sent by Paula Mitchell, again, the director of the LA Innocence Project. And you can even see within this motion an email exchange between her and the prosecutor's office. Essentially, it shows, the back and forth of Paula Mitchell asking the prosecution to hand over the evidence they're asking for so they don't have to litigate the matter. She adds that the LA Innocence Project is, of course, prepared to use their funding to pay for the pricey DNA testing or retesting that they would like to be done in regards to the bloody mattress and other pieces of evidence in the case. Now, interestingly, Paula Mitchell is also asking that the original prosecutors on this case not handle this new motion. In her email, she references several government guidelines and articles around this very issue. Not to mention, remember, there's that whole accusation within the motion of prosecutorial misconduct, that there was a conflict of interest here anyway. If this prosecutor, Birgit Flanagan, was having an affair with an investigator on the case. But anyway, Birgit, the prosecutor, did shoot back in her reply to Paula. Your 64-page request lists a few items which were purportedly not included in the initial discovery to defendant Peterson's original trial counsel, and several other items. However, you have peppered this request with accusations for which as you state in the request, you have chosen to withhold the basis. This lack of full and complete disclosure calls into question the suggested intent of transparent reciprocal discovery process, especially given your implied claim of innocence. The fact that you have chosen to withhold items you claim to possess that support some of your assertions is troubling. However, it is our office's intention to respond to your request in due course, given the grant by the First District Court of Appeal for a 6-month extension for your reply brief to the Attorney General's informal response. Then she went on to suggest that they schedule a meeting to go over everything, and she concludes her letter with, "This office continues to strive to ensure justice for the victims of crime as well as justice for the accused, charged, prosecuted, and convicted." And yeah, wow. I mean, at this point, it is all about the victims, right? You know, you still have Scott Peterson for the past 20 years claiming he had nothing to do with it. And if all this burglary stuff is as shady as it appears to be in this motion, it is only fair to Laci's family, to Laci, to Connor, to Scott, if he's innocent, that we actually find out who really was responsible for this crime. I mean, isn't that what this is all about? Nobody should have any problem with this evidence being looked at, especially if it's being funded by an organization such as the Los Angeles Innocence Project. I say I can't imagine how people wouldn't want this to be done in the case of actually getting justice for Laci and Connor Peterson. That is what is truly most important here. So at this point, that is all we know about what is going on with this motion. And I will say that in the past, Scott's lawyers have asked many times for these very same items, but Prosecutor Berget replies that there, quote, are none or they were already provided. So going by that from years ago, I'm willing to bet that they will have the same exact type reply to these other aforementioned things. However, there's different things in here that should be interesting to see. Obviously, if they test the DNA evidence, that's something completely different that was never brought up before. Who knows? Now that they are hammering so hard on this van fire and blood evidence, now that we even see this fire investigator coming out to the media saying he was always kind of weirded out and that he always had bad feelings about this not being looked at as much as he thought it should be. And that said, it just goes to show that there are many people still investigating this case in the background every single day, both private investigators and investigative reporters who have been working on this case since day one, really. And it seems like every single year we are hearing more and more compelling evidence that, I don't know, maybe points to a chance that it's possible there was more circumstantial or actual evidence that point away from Scott Peterson and towards these burglary suspects that many people ever realized before. But with that, that's really all I have for today. And you know that I will keep you updated on this case as soon as I hear more. Of course, I will hop on here. If you appreciate what you have heard here today, please take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'm just starting out. I would really appreciate your support. Please tune in to part 3 of this series, where I read some stunning declarations from senior investigative journalist Mike Gudgel and the man who investigated the van fire, former Modesto Fire Department investigator Brian Spitulski. But thank you very much for watching, and be careful out there.